I'll give you $100,000 if you serve me in Chinese. George Robinson's voice, sharp and theatrical, boomed across the crystal-lit dining room of the Royal Haven Hotel, one of the most exclusive establishments in New York. Conversations froze. Silverware clinked to a stop. All eyes turned to the young black maid standing at his table. Sarah Martins, 28 years old, stood stiffly with a tray balanced in her hand. She wore the standard Navy maid's uniform of the hotel, polished but impersonal. George, a 45-year-old billionaire real estate developer known as much for his arrogance as for his fortune, reclined in his chair like a king addressing a servant. 3 European investors beside him chuckled uneasily. Bundles of green bills spilled from George's pocket onto the linen-draped table, a spectacle of wealth turned into a weapon. He tapped the stack with 2 fingers and smirked. $100 grand, sweetheart. More than you make in 5 years cleaning rooms. But here's the catch. Convince my guests in Mandarin, and it's yours. Fail, and you apologize here, in front of everyone, for wasting our time. If this moment has you on the edge of your seat, don't move just yet, because what George thought was a harmless game is about to spiral into something he never imagined. Sarah may look like just another maid in uniform, but she carries a secret so powerful it could shatter his arrogance in front of everyone. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe and like this video so you don't miss what happens next, because trust me, this story is only getting started. George Robinson leaned back in his chair, the kind of lean that belonged to men who thought they owned every room they entered. The crystal chandelier light caught the sharp edges of his smile as he tapped the neat stack of $100 bills on the table. His fingers lingered over the green paper like a magician about to perform a trick. "You see, gentlemen," he said, turning to his 3 investors, "this is how you test people. Strip away the uniform, the politeness, the act, and you find out who they really are." The investors shifted, glances darting between George and the maid in front of them. The German man with silver hair cleared his throat but said nothing. He was not comfortable, yet he stayed silent. After all, George Robinson was the reason they were sitting here in the most expensive dining hall in Manhattan, sipping champagne worth more than some men's yearly salaries. Sarah Martins held the tray steady in her hands, but her knuckles whitened around the edges. She had learned to keep her face unreadable. It was survival. Maids who showed too much feeling became easy targets, especially in the Royal Haven Hotel where the wealthy came to display power disguised as sophistication. George's voice cut through the quiet and sharp. Look at her. 28, maybe 30. A maid in a polished uniform, earning crumbs while carrying plates for men who actually matter. She probably never finished college. This, he waved his hand dismissively, is her ceiling. The investors gave forced laughs, though one of them, a younger man with a narrow jaw, shifted uncomfortably. George mistook their unease for amusement and pressed harder. She's probably watched a few martial arts movies, learned a word or two, and thinks she can impress us with some gibberish. Isn't that right, sweetheart? He didn't wait for Sarah to answer. He looked at his guests again, lowering his voice into the tone of a teacher explaining a simple lesson. This is America. Here, English and money are the only languages worth speaking. The words hung heavy in the air, slicing through whatever dignity Sarah had been left with. Conversations from nearby tables slowed to a hush. Diners leaned closer to hear the humiliation unfold. Phones tilted discreetly, recording. Still, Sarah did not speak. Silence was her shield. Inside, however, her chest rose with measured breaths. Each inhale carried memories. Memories George could never imagine. She remembered Beijing, long nights bent over a desk, practicing Mandarin tones until her throat ached. She remembered her professor's harsh voice. If you cannot explain a Sichuan dish in perfect Beijing dialect, you are not ready. She remembered the applause of students when she lectured at Howard, the admiration of peers, the research papers stamped with her name. But that was another life. This one was smaller, quieter, reduced to the space of a tray balanced between trembling fingers. George mistook her quiet for weakness. He leaned forward, savoring it. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue. Don't tell me the $100 grand isn't tempting. That's more than you'll see in 5 years cleaning bathrooms and changing sheets. He laughed, a harsh sound that clashed with the crystal elegance around him. Sarah's gaze flicked to the investors. 2 looked away. The third forced a smile, embarrassed. No one spoke up. Power was with George, and they weren't going to risk offending him. But Sarah's silence was not surrender. Behind her calm eyes, a storm gathered. The weight of years of sacrifice pressed against her ribs, building a quiet resolve. George clapped his hands once, the sound sharp like a gunshot. "Let's make this more interesting, shall we?" He gestured to a waiter lingering nervously by the door. "Bring us the Shanghai menu." The waiter froze. "Mr. Robinson, the Shanghai menu has over 40 dishes. Very technical. It's not usually." "Perfect," George interrupted. He grinned at the investors, his teeth gleaming. "If our maid here truly knows Chinese, then she won't struggle with a few culinary terms." The German investor shook his head slightly, murmuring, "George, this isn't necessary." George raised a hand, silencing him. "It's more than necessary. It's entertainment. This is how you separate the frauds from the real ones. Watch and learn." He turned back to Sarah, smirk widening. "If you fail, you kneel here, in front of all of us, and you apologize for wasting our time." For a moment, Sarah let the words wash over her. The dining room was still, waiting. She shifted her weight, pressing her tray firmly against her side, grounding herself. Her voice came soft, but it did not waver. "I accept." The investors' eyes widened. A few guests gasped audibly. George's smirk faltered just for a second before returning with double the cruelty. "Good," he said, snapping his fingers as the waiter hurried off. "Then tonight, we'll see whether you're more than a uniform. But don't get your hopes up, sweetheart. You're about to be reminded of your place." The chandelier light glinted off the untouched bills on the table. The trap was set. The spectacle was only beginning. Before the chandelier-lit dining room, before the trays and uniforms, before the humiliation of George Robinson's game, Sarah Martins had been someone else entirely. There had been a time when she walked onto stages with microphones clipped to her blouse and lecture halls fell into silence, waiting for her voice. She had been Dr. Sarah Martins, linguistics scholar, one of the youngest to complete her doctorate in comparative linguistics at Howard University. Words weren't just tools to her, they were living bridges between cultures, maps of human history etched in sound and syntax. At 25, she had been invited to Beijing on a fellowship. For 6 months, she lived in a cramped apartment near the China Foreign Languages University. Her world was textbooks stacked to the ceiling, street markets filled with steaming buns, the clipped tones of Mandarin in the air like a song she was determined to master. She remembered the way the Beijing winter seeped into her bones, the way her professor would drill her late into the night. If you cannot explain the dishes of Sichuan cuisine in perfect tones, Sarah, you are not ready. And she had cried sometimes, quietly into her pillow. But she had learned. Hours stretched into nights, nights into mornings. Slowly, Mandarin bent to her will, then Cantonese, then Taiwanese dialects. She wrote a paper on the evolution of food terminology in Chinese culture, so precise, so original, that it was published in a respected journal. Professors praised her as a rising star. When she returned to the United States, her name began to carry weight. She spoke at conferences in Washington, lectured in universities, published research on Arabic verb morphology, Russian phonetics, and the subtle rhythm of Swahili poetry. She was the young black woman proving that brilliance could not be boxed by prejudice. And her secret pride? She could hold a conversation in 9 languages, slipping from one to the other as easily as most people switched shoes. Her life seemed untouchable, her future carved in gold. Until the phone call. It came one night past midnight. A voice heavy with dread. "Sarah, it's your mother. She's had a stroke. It's serious." In an instant, her world collapsed. Dorothy Martins, her only family, the woman who had raised her alone, lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Specialists recommended procedures that cost more than Sarah earned in a year. At first, she thought she could manage, cut corners, take loans. But the bills piled like snow until they became an avalanche. She sold everything. Her small apartment in D.C., her car, even her jewelry. When that wasn't enough, she borrowed, then borrowed again. The numbers bled red on every page until she could no longer breathe under their weight. Bankruptcy came swift, cruel, final. Her university filled her post with someone else. Calls from colleagues grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. Friends offered sympathy but disappeared when she could no longer attend conferences or fund their research trips. She tried to hold on, adjunct teaching, side jobs, but her mother's care consumed everything. The medication alone devoured half her paychecks. Then the foreclosure notice came. She remembered holding it in her trembling hands, her mother asleep in the next room, and knowing she had nothing left to sell except her time and her dignity. That was how Dr. Sarah Martins became Sarah the Maid. It was supposed to be temporary. Just a few months cleaning rooms, folding sheets, serving the wealthy in hotels until she caught her balance again. But months turned into years. One uniform became another. The woman who once lectured about tonal variations in Mandarin now scrubbed bathrooms and carried trays of champagne bottles worth more than her entire monthly salary. And yet, beneath the uniform, she never surrendered. In the quiet hours after shifts, while her mother slept, she opened her old books. She logged into academic portals she still had access to. She read papers in French, Russian, Mandarin, Spanish. She practiced pronunciations under her breath while polishing silverware. She kept the flame alive, even when no one cared to see it. The world had written her off. Guests in the Royal Haven Hotel didn't look at her twice. To them she was invisible, a shadow in a navy dress. And George Robinson? To him she was nothing more than a prop in his endless performance of arrogance. But what he didn't know, what no one in that glittering dining hall yet realized, was that the maid he mocked had stood before ambassadors and translated their speeches. She had debated in halls filled with scholars, defended her research before some of the sharpest minds in the world. She had once been introduced as the woman who speaks in 9 tongues. Now, as she stood frozen under George's cruel smirk, those memories didn't shame her. They strengthened her. She was no longer just remembering who she was reclaiming it. George tapped the table again, breaking the silence. "Shanghai menu," he barked at the waiter, his voice ringing like a whip. The investors exchanged uncertain glances. They sensed this was spiraling into something ugly, but none dared stop it. Sarah lifted her eyes from the tray in her hands. For the first time, she did not lower her gaze. Her spine straightened, shoulders squared. She stood taller, prouder, no longer hiding behind invisibility. The dining room hadn't seen it yet. George hadn't recognized it. But in that moment, Sarah Martins was no longer just the maid. She was the scholar, the linguist, the fighter who had already survived greater battles than this. And whether the billionaire realized it or not, the balance of power in the room had begun to shift. George Robinson swirled the deep red wine in his glass, the light from the chandelier catching the movement like liquid fire. His smirk stretched wider, sharpened with cruelty. He leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table as if preparing to preside over a trial. His voice, loud enough to hush the remaining murmurs of the room, cut through the heavy silence. "Let's be clear," he said, wagging a finger in Sarah's direction. "This isn't about a couple of words. I don't want to hear fortune cookie lines. No cheap phrases you've picked up watching kung fu movies. If you're going to earn my 100,000, you'll have to impress my guests here in real Mandarin. Not broken phrases. Not stuttering syllables. Real sentences. Real fluency." He paused to sip his wine, savoring his performance. Then his grin sharpened. The cruelty in his tone made even his guests shift in their seats. The German investor's silver brows drew together. The younger man looked down at his plate. Still, none dared speak. The balance of power belonged to George Robinson. Sarah's fingers curled against the tray pressed to her side. She took in his words, the mockery, the condescension. For a moment, the weight of the room pressed down like a mountain. All those eyes, waiting for her collapse. Then she inhaled, steady and slow, and let the breath anchor her. "I accept," she said. Her voice was quiet but unshaken. George blinked once. His smirk faltered for the barest fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to accept. But the moment passed, and arrogance surged back into his expression. "Well then," he said with mock applause, clapping his hands slowly. "Look at that. Our maid has spirit. She actually believes she can do it." His laugh rang out, hollow and grating. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't laughing. Something in Sarah's steady tone had unsettled them. George leaned back, a spark of mischief flaring in his eyes. He wasn't about to let the spectacle end so quickly. No, he would raise the stakes. Crush her so thoroughly that she would never forget it. "You know what?" he said suddenly, slamming his palm flat against the table. Glasses rattled, the sharp sound jolting the room. "Let's double it. $200,000 if you manage to convince my guests." The crowd stirred. 200,000. Half a year's salary for some of the men dining there, an impossible sum for a maid in uniform. "And if you fail," George's grin widened into something feral. "Not only do you kneel, you work here for free. 1 full month. Scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, changing sheets. All for nothing. Because fraud deserves no pay." He laughed, and the investors forced uneasy smiles. Sarah's heart pounded once, hard, like a drum echoing through her ribs. 200,000. The kind of money that could pay down debts, secure her mother's treatment for months, buy her breathing room for the first time in years. But even more than the money, it was the humiliation hanging in the air, the cruelty of the man smirking at her like she was already broken. She lifted her chin. "Agreed." Her words were calm, almost serene. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the air seemed to pause. George leaned forward, his grin wavering as if he hadn't heard her right. "What did you say?" "I said agreed," Sarah repeated, her voice firmer now. 200,000 if I succeed. A month of labor without pay if I fail." The investors stared at her. Some in the crowd who had been recording this quietly whispered to one another. A maid had just stared down a billionaire and accepted impossible odds without blinking. But Sarah wasn't finished. She took one step closer to the table, eyes locked on George's. Her tone shifted, no longer the voice of a maid, but of the scholar, the woman who once lectured in grand halls. "And one more condition," she said, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "If I succeed, you don't just pay me. You apologize. Here. In front of everyone. For the words you've spoken tonight. And for every time you've used your money to treat people as less than human." The room erupted in murmurs. Heads turned, jaws dropped. Even the investors drew sharp breaths. George's smirk froze. For a heartbeat, uncertainty flickered across his face. A public apology. He hadn't counted on her countering. His pride clawed at him, warning him to reject it. But then he caught the eyes of the investors, watching him closely, judging. And around them, the whole dining hall, guests leaning forward, waiters clutching trays, phones recording. To back out now would make him look like a coward. His jaw tightened. He forced a laugh. "You're bold, I'll give you that. Very well, Maid. If by some miracle you succeed, I'll apologize." He jabbed a finger at her. "But when you fail, and you will, you'll regret this. Because pride comes before the fall." The German investor shook his head slowly, muttering something in his native tongue. The younger man stared at Sarah with new respect, as though seeing her for the first time. The third kept his expression neutral, but his silence spoke louder than words. George snapped his fingers, calling for the waiter. "Bring the Shanghai menu. Let's see what our maid is really made of." The waiter hesitated at the door, but George's glare sent him hurrying off. Sarah stood tall now, shoulders squared, eyes steady. She wasn't trembling anymore. The dining room hadn't realized it yet, but the stage that George Robinson had built for humiliation was about to become his undoing. The bet was sealed. And the game had only just begun. The waiter returned, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the heavy leather-bound Shanghai menu on the white linen table. It was the kind of menu few guests ever saw, 40 dishes with intricate descriptions written in both English and Chinese, crafted for visiting dignitaries and business elites. Tonight, It wasn't just a menu. It was a weapon. George Robinson seized it and flipped it open dramatically, scanning the pages as though he himself could read the Mandarin characters printed in gold. He smirked, then shoved it across the table towards Sarah Martin's. The leather creaked as it landed. "There," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "Show us what you've got. Pick your dishes. Convince my friends. Or admit you've wasted everyone's time." The room was silent except for the faint hum of chandeliers above. Sarah reached out and laid her hand on the menu. Her fingers brushed the cool leather. She opened it slowly, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she looked calm. But those who studied her face closely, the set of her jaw, the steady rhythm of her breathing, would notice something else. Not fear, but control. She was not a woman staring at the edge of defeat. She was a woman recalling a language she had already mastered, one syllable at a time. As her eyes scanned the dishes, memories tugged at her. Beijing. Winter nights when frost crawled across her window. A cramped desk illuminated by a flickering lamp. Pages of notebooks filled with characters she copied over and over until her hand cramped. Her professor's voice still echoed in her mind, stern and relentless. Doctoral candidate Martins, if you cannot explain a Sichuan dish with perfect tonal precision, how do you expect to translate trade agreements for governments? His words had cut deep. She had cried more nights than she could count, tears blurring ink on the page, despair heavy on her chest. But she hadn't quit. She remembered standing before a panel of Chinese academics, her palms sweating, her throat dry. For 2 hours, they fired questions in rapid Mandarin about food etymology, dialectical variations, and cultural symbolism. And for 2 hours, she had answered flawlessly. She had walked out exhausted, trembling, but triumphant. That night, she realized what persistence could carve out of suffering. Back in the present, Sarah lifted her gaze from the menu. Around her, the Royal Haven dining hall was frozen in anticipation. Waiters stood rooted in place, silver trays half raised. Diners who had been laughing minutes earlier now sat stiffly, forks untouched, eyes locked on the spectacle unfolding at George's table. Several discreetly angled their phones, recording every moment. The tension pressed against the walls, thick enough to choke. George Robinson, however, lounged in his chair as though this were theater crafted solely for his amusement. He sipped his wine, legs crossed, smirk never leaving his face. "Take your time, sweetheart," he sneered. "If you even know what you're looking at." The investors weren't so sure. The German man's silver brows knitted tighter with every passing second. The younger one leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The third investor tapped his finger nervously against the tablecloth. Sarah ignored them all. She let the silence work for her. Her thumb traced the delicate characters on the page, her lips moving faintly, not in English, but in Mandarin, testing the tones under her breath. Her calm wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. This was no longer about money. This was about dignity. About proving that brilliance could survive even when buried under a maid's uniform. From across the room, a woman whispered to her companion, "She's going to fail." But her companion shook his head slowly. "I don't think so." George didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in his performance. He leaned back smugly, spreading his arms wide as if addressing the entire hall. "Gentlemen, I hope you're ready for a good laugh. Our maid here thinks she's about to impress us with some parlor trick." He chuckled, his voice grating. This is the problem with people like her. Always thinking they're more than they are. Sarah heard every word. They didn't wound her anymore. If anything, they fueled her. She remembered every insult from professors who doubted her, every sneer from classmates who thought a black woman didn't belong in linguistics research, every moment of being underestimated. George's voice was just another echo of that long history. She closed the menu gently, not slamming it, not rushing. She lifted her eyes and let them lock with George's. For the first time that evening, the room felt the weight of her gaze. It wasn't defiance. It was something more dangerous. Certainty. She inhaled deeply, steady and calm, filling her lungs with air that seemed to silence even the clinking of glasses. To the audience, it looked like a pause. But to Sarah, It was the calm before her strike, the final moment before knowledge, discipline, and fire came pouring out of her. George smirked one last time, raising his glass. "Well, sweetheart," he said, arrogance dripping from every syllable. "Let's hear your little show." And the dining hall held its breath. Sarah Martins placed the heavy Shanghai menu on the table. Her hand lingered for a moment, her fingertips pressed against the leather cover as though sealing away the years of humiliation that had led her here. She looked up, and the air in the royal haven seemed to shift. Then, with a calmness that startled even herself, she began to speak. Mandarin flowed from her tongue like water over polished stone. The tones were flawless, rising and falling with musical precision, each syllable clipped and exact. Her voice carried a weight of authority, not of a servant addressing masters, but of a scholar reclaiming her stage. The first words silenced the entire dining hall. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Diners who had leaned back in smug anticipation now leaned forward, eyes widening. Waiters froze mid-step, silver trays trembling in their hands. Even the investors at George Robinson's table jerked upright. The German man's fork clattered against his plate. The younger one whispered, "Mein Gott," under his breath. Sarah's cadence never faltered. She gestured toward the menu with practiced grace, her words weaving together history and flavor, culture and science. "Jin Wan de De Dao Kai," she said smoothly in Mandarin. "Authentic Sichuan mapo tofu. Prepared with 2-year-aged Sichuan chili paste, layered with a numbing bite of Sichuan peppercorn. A dish born in the Qing dynasty, its balance of heat and mala, the perfect union of numbness and spice, symbolizes resilience and harmony." Her pronunciation struck like a bell, precise, resonant, unshakable. Gasps rippled again. A couple near the back set their wine glasses down with trembling hands. Phones tilted discreetly, cameras recording the spectacle. This was no broken "thank you" or clumsy greeting. This was mastery. Sarah turned the page, her tone steady, her eyes calm. "Jie xia lai," she continued. "We have xiao long bao, Shanghai soup dumplings. Each dumpling carefully folded with exactly 18 pleats. 18. A number representing prosperity in Chinese culture. Inside, the broth is crafted from gelatinized pork marrow, liquefied by steam, perfected through generations of Shanghai tradition." Her words carried weight, not only because of their accuracy but because of the way she delivered them, with the ease of someone who had spent years immersed in the culture she spoke of. This wasn't memorization. This was lived scholarship. The German investor leaned forward, whispering to his companion. She's not just fluent. She's academic." His voice trembled with awe. Sarah continued. Her voice did not rise in arrogance nor crack in fear. It was steady, commanding. She turned the page again, and her gaze swept the room before falling on George Robinson. "Di Sandao Kai, our third course, is Beijing's most celebrated Peking duck. Prepared according to the Quanjude method, perfected in 1864. 24 hours of marinating. A traditional fruitwood oven. Skin crisped to golden perfection, meat sliced in exactly 108 cuts, representing completeness in Chinese numerology." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like music. "This dish," she concluded, "is not just food. It is the embodiment of centuries of refinement. A cultural treasure, carried on a plate." For a long, breathless moment, the room said nothing. The chandeliers sparkled above, the wine glasses glimmered, and Sarah stood at the edge of the table like a conductor who had just completed a symphony. Then the reaction came. Gasps broke into murmurs. Murmurs swelled into astonishment. Diners turned to one another in disbelief. "Did you hear her? That was perfect. She's better than native speakers." The investors were transfixed. The German man pressed a hand to his chest. The younger one leaned so far forward his chair nearly tipped. The third, stoic, reserved, finally allowed his eyes to widen, the mask of neutrality cracking under genuine awe. "And George Robinson?" His smirk faltered. For the first time that evening, his face showed something other than arrogance. His jaw tightened. His fingers, once so casually drumming against the table, curled into fists. This This has to be rehearsed, he muttered under his breath, but no one was listening. All eyes were on Sarah. And she wasn't finished. She closed the menu softly and straightened her shoulders. But of course, she said smoothly, switching tongues without pause. In Hong Kong, one might present the same dishes differently. The shift was seamless. Cantonese now rolled from her lips with perfect cadence, her accent precise, her tone authentic. She spoke not just as a scholar but as someone who had lived within the language. She described the dumplings again, this time layering cultural anecdotes tied to Cantonese tea houses, their role in Qing dynasty gatherings, their survival as a symbol of identity amid colonial turbulence. She painted history into food, culture into cuisine, and did it with a confidence that made the listeners feel they were being educated, not entertained. The German investor slammed a hand lightly against the table. Perfect Cantonese. Authentic. His voice was shaking. Do you understand what we are witnessing? Phones across the dining room captured every syllable. Some guests whispered into their cameras. She's speaking Mandarin and Cantonese flawlessly. She's a maid. A maid. George's face drained of color. His grin had completely collapsed now, replaced by a flickering mask of disbelief. He looked around wildly, waiting for someone to dismiss it, to call it a trick, a performance. But the only sounds in the dining hall were Sarah's voice and the soft hum of cameras recording his downfall. Sarah let her final Cantonese phrase linger in the air, her tone rising like the end of a symphony. She bowed her head slightly, not in submission, but in punctuation. The room erupted into applause. Not the polite, restrained applause of high society, but the thunderous, unrestrained clapping of people who had just witnessed the impossible. And at the center of it all stood Sarah Martins, once invisible, now undeniable. George Robinson had wanted a spectacle. And he had won. But it was not the show he had imagined. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The applause that had crashed like surf against the walls of the Royal Haven ebbed into a stunned hush. George Robinson's chair scraped back with a violent squeal. His face, once lacquered with arrogance, was chalk white. "Who are you?" he blurted, voice cracking, eyes wild as if he'd just seen a ghost step out of a maid's uniform. Sarah Martins laid a steady palm on the menu, closed it with care, and set it on the linen. No flourish. No performance. Just a quiet, final click that sounded like a door locking from the inside. "I am Dr. Sarah Martins," she said, every syllable clear. PhD in linguistics. Fluent in 9 languages. The impact landed like a shockwave. Glasses chimed as someone's hand trembled. One of the investors sat back hard enough to rattle silverware. Across the room, a woman gasped, her phone still filming, the red record blazing like an accusation. George's mouth opened and closed. No, that's not. You're a maid. Sarah didn't move. Tonight, yes. I am a maid. And I am also a doctor. Both can be true. The German investor swallowed, color rising in his cheeks. "George," he murmured, barely above a whisper. "What have you done?" George doubled down, the way men do when the ground gives way beneath them. "This is a trick. A setup. She's lying." He jabbed a finger in Sarah's direction. "People like you don't end up here with rags and trays. Not if you're real." Sarah tilted her head, calm as a judge. "People like me? You know what I mean," he snapped. "No," she replied, voice soft but edged with steel. "Say it clearly." Silence ballooned. At the fringes, servers froze mid-step, their black vests and white shirts like chess pieces waiting for a move. Diners sat forward, some with hands clasped, as if prayer might keep them from missing a single word. George faltered. "You're pretending. Exaggerating. You think a few fancy sentences impress men like us." "They impressed your guests," Sarah said. "And they impressed you enough to look afraid." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I'm not afraid of you. You're afraid of what I represent," she said. "That the world you built, where money buys voice and power, cannot silence knowledge when it chooses to speak." A murmur pulsed through the room. The younger investor leaned in, eyes shining with something like awe. "Is it true?" he asked, almost gently. 9 languages?" Sarah met him with the same even gaze. Yes. Mandarin, Cantonese, Arabic, French, Spanish, Russian, German, Swahili, English. I taught. I researched. I translated for people who never looked twice at the shoes I wore. She let that hang, then turned back to George. And then my mother got sick. The bills drowned us. I sold everything. The world applauded my papers, but not one applause paid for medicine. So I took the jobs that were available, the ones people like you never see until you need the bed made and the glass refilled. George scoffed, but it sounded thin. If you were what you say, you wouldn't be here. Why not? Sarah asked. Don't scholars eat? Don't they bleed? Don't they take care of parents who raise them? Don't they choose dignity over pride when life breaks the plan? The words hit like a series of clean strikes. George blinked, staggered by something he couldn't buy, bully, or bluff. The German investor spoke, voice tight with frustration. George, you dragged us into a cruelty we never agreed to. We came to discuss a partnership, not to watch you parade your contempt. George rounded on him. You think I'm the villain because she can recite a menu? Be serious. This is business. No, Sarah said, and the room turned back to her. This is what you call entertainment. A bet where humiliation is the prize. She took a slow step forward, never raising her voice. You told me to kneel, to apologize for wasting your time. But your time is not a throne, Mr. Robinson. It is a clock like everyone else's, and tonight it ran out on your certainty about who matters. He tried to laugh, but the sound couldn't find air. You people always make it about morality. It is about morality, the younger investor cut in, surprising himself. And about judgment. Yours. Sarah didn't smile. You asked who I am. Let me answer fully. She faced the room, not just the table, the diners with their phones, the servers with their trays, the musicians by the grand piano who had stopped mid-piece. My name is Dr. Sarah Martins. I studied the maps inside language, the paths memory takes through a people's food, stories, and songs. I've stood in halls where the lights were brighter than these and argued with professors in tones sharper than anything you threw at me tonight. I also work here. I change linens and carry trays. Both can be true. Because life is complicated. Because love costs. Because survival doesn't ask your permission. A hush so complete fell over the royal haven that even the chandelier seemed to go quiet. Sarah turned back to George, and now her words were scalpel clean. You made a bet to prove I was small. But I was never the subject of your lesson. You were. What lesson? He asked, but there was no fight left in it. That arrogance is loud and competence is often quiet, she said. That privilege confuses volume for value. That a uniform tells you nothing about a person's worth. He looked at the bills on the table as if they might assemble themselves into an answer. You think you're better than me? I think I don't have to be better than you to be worthy, Sarah replied. I think the dishwasher in the back is worthy. The bellhop at the door. The woman who taught me multiplication at a chipped desk in a public school classroom. Worth isn't a trophy you hand out when you're in the mood. A soft exhale swept the room. The German investor stared at his hands, ashamed. The younger one sat straighter, as if absorbing a new gravity. The third investor, who had watched in cool silence, finally spoke. Mr. Robinson, even if she were not a scholar, what you staged would still be indefensible. George swallowed. You don't understand how this city works. We understand perfectly, the third investor replied. We simply refuse to pretend this is normal. Sarah nodded once, as if acknowledging a verdict rendered. Then she drew the line that could not be stepped over. We agreed to terms. You set them. I accepted. I fulfilled mine. George's eyes darted to the money, then back to her. This isn't finished. It is, she said gently. Because what you wanted was a public spectacle, and you got one. Just not the kind you planned. He groped for anger and found only confusion. You humiliated me. No, Sarah said. You did that when you mistook cruelty for power. I merely spoke. The sentence landed with the weight of a gavel. Somewhere in the room, a phone chimed, the soft ping of a live stream hitting 100,000 viewers. Heads turned. Whispers started. The tidal pull of the internet had already entered the room, a current George could not swim against. Sarah glanced at the menu, closed, finished, and then at the faces around her, staff holding their breath, diners who would go home and tell this story at immaculate tables, investors who had come for numbers and found a mirror. She lifted her chin. You asked who I am. I'm the reminder you didn't know you needed, that the world is full of people you underestimate. And some of them are done being quiet. No one clapped. Not yet. The silence was too full, too sacred. It was the split second before a storm breaks or a verdict is read. George stood stranded in it, small for the first time in the room he thought he owned. And then, from the back, a single pair of hands began to applaud. Another joined. Then another. The sound rolled forward like thunder crossing marble, gathering strength, cresting over linen and crystal until it became the only sound that mattered. Sarah didn't bow. She didn't need to. She had already risen. The air in the grand hall shifted. What had begun as a display of George's wealth and dominance was unraveling before everyone's eyes. His investors, once loyal shadows, began to step back. Murmurs rippled through the rows of tables, quiet at first, then swelling into sharp whispers that cut like blades. Cameras turned, lenses focusing on his trembling hands, capturing every crack in the mask of confidence he had worn for decades. One voice rose above the noise. This isn't leadership. It's arrogance. Another echoed. We trusted you, George. The room that once applauded him now judged him. And he could feel it. Every look was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. Sarah did not raise her voice, but the stillness around her made every word fall heavy. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. Food carries memory. Language carries dignity. To dismiss one is to dismiss both. The hall fell into silence. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a sentence. Those words struck deeper than any financial loss, because they revealed the truth. His empire was hollow, built on the humiliation of others. George staggered as if the weight of her words pressed down on him. He looked around for support, but none came. Investors who had once clapped his back now looked away. Guests who had once envied his power now whispered, shaking their heads. The predator had become prey. His voice cracked. Fine, I'll pay. He reached for the pen with trembling fingers, signing away a fortune not just in money, but in pride. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stepped closer, calm but unyielding. The money doesn't matter. What matters is the respect you denied. You owe an apology, not to me, but to everyone you've demeaned. For a moment, George's jaw clenched. He wanted to refuse, to sneer as he always had. But the silence around him was suffocating. The cameras didn't blink. The audience didn't move. He was cornered, not by fists, but by truth. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then in a whisper, I apologize. Sarah tilted her head. Louder. The demand echoed through the room, and for the first time in his life, George's defiance broke. His voice rose, trembling with anger and shame. I apologize. The word exploded across the hall. And with it, the room erupted in applause. Not for him, but for Sarah, for the dignity reclaimed, for the justice that had finally been spoken aloud. George collapsed back into his chair, small and shrunken, his empire reduced to rubble in the span of minutes. The cameras kept rolling, documenting the fall of a man who once believed himself untouchable. And Sarah stood steady, her victory not in wealth, but in truth. 6 months had passed. The maid's uniform that once defined Sarah was gone. No apron, no lowered gaze, no invisible silence. She walked into the sleek glass tower of a global communications firm, not as a servant, but as its newly appointed director of cultural communications. Her stride was confident, her attire professional yet understated, and when she spoke, people listened. She was no longer the woman serving drinks in the corner of someone else's empire. She was now shaping conversations across the world. The moment that had catapulted her here still lived online, playing on screens in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms around the globe. The viral video was impossible to ignore. Billionaire mocked. Black Maid spoke 9 languages. The clip had been shared millions of times, dissected in news panels, quoted in think pieces, and celebrated in communities that had too often been silenced. Sarah had become more than a headline. She was a symbol. Meanwhile, George was crumbling. His empire, once unshakable, began to collapse like a house built on sand. Investors pulled out one by one, unwilling to tie their reputations to a man now branded as arrogant, racist, and out of touch. Business partners canceled deals. Media outlets that once praised him now tore him apart with the same cameras that had captured his downfall. Even his family, once silent enablers, began to distance themselves. Whispers grew louder, children embarrassed, wife absent, siblings ashamed. George, once the predator circling boardrooms, had become a ghost in his own mansion. A shell of a man, wandering through empty halls lined with portraits of triumph that now felt like mockery. For Sarah, life had shifted in every way. Yet she did not chase revenge. Her work was her focus, amplifying voices, teaching corporations that culture is not decoration but foundation, showing leaders that respect is not charity but necessity. And in that role, she carried the scars of her past not as shame, but as armor. One autumn evening, she stood on the stage of a packed lecture hall. The room was dim, but the spotlight caught her calm, steady face. Rows of students, executives, and everyday people sat waiting. She began softly, her words woven with experience. 6 months ago, she said, I was seen as invisible. To many, I was just a maid, someone to clean, to serve, to be ignored. But invisibility does not mean absence. Every person carries a history, a culture, a dignity that cannot be stripped away. The audience leaned in, remembering the clip that had brought them here, the voice that had silenced a billionaire. Sarah's tone deepened, her rhythm deliberate, each word echoing with conviction. I am often asked if I sought revenge, if my goal was to see a man brought low. But the truth is simpler. The best revenge is not destruction. It is rising so high their insults become soil for your strength. The words landed heavy, then lifted the room. Heads nodded. Some eyes glistened. Sarah paused, letting silence work as power, the way she had learned it could. Then she added, George's words once sought to shame me. Today, they are the reason I stand here. His attempt to break me became my foundation to build higher. The hall erupted into applause, wave after wave of sound. People rose from their seats, clapping until the walls seemed to tremble. A standing ovation, not for the fall of a billionaire, but for the rise of a woman who had turned humiliation into triumph. In that moment, Sarah did not see cameras or headlines. She saw possibility. For the maid still working long shifts with no recognition. For the immigrant speaking broken English but carrying 3 other languages inside them. For the child told their accent was wrong. Her story was no longer just hers. It was a map, showing others how dignity, once reclaimed, can light the path forward. And as the ovation thundered, Sarah stood steady, smiling but resolute, knowing this was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. Her triumph was now immortalized, not just in a viral clip, but in the hearts of everyone who had ever been told they were less. The hall lights dimmed. The applause echoed. Sarah Martins had risen. And she was never going back. Because sometimes, the most powerful victories are not won with wealth, or status, or force, but with dignity, knowledge, and the courage to stand tall when the world expects you to bow. Sarah's story reminds us that every voice carries weight, every life holds value, and no uniform can erase the power of what's within. This was her rise, but it is also a mirror for us all. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next chapter, and share this video with someone who believes dignity can outlast arrogance. And now I'll ask you, what part of Sarah's journey spoke to you most? Was it her courage to stand in that dining hall, or the way she transformed humiliation into triumph? Let's talk in the comments. Until next time.